Hi, everybody. Today is Wednesday, December 4th, and Ambassador Chas Freeman is here with us. Welcome back, Ambassador.
Thank you. Glad to be back.
We have a new conflict within the government in South Korea. Right now, the president is blaming on North Korea. The parliament is against him. And what's going on, Ambassador, in South Korea, and the main reason of this difference between the parliament and the president?
Well, President Yoon, who is a right-wing um, figure who only recently joined politics, he was a prosecutor by profession. He had no previous political record. He was elected about 2 years ago to a 5-year term. He's very unpopular. Uh, the opposition has blocked him on a number of issues that were important to him. Among other things, he's become very close to the United States. He's been praised by Kurt Campbell, the Deputy Secretary of State, by President Biden, and others for his willingness to cooperate with Japan. And anybody who knows anything about Korean politics will realize that cooperation with Japan is something that the Korean right wing, some of them, did during the Japanese occupation and after that. For a long time, the presidents of South Korea were actually former members of the Japanese Imperial Army who had been trained in the military academies in Japan. Anyway, this is very unpopular in Korea, and he has diminished in popularity. He's only popular, about 20% of the population support him. So his answer to this was to declare martial law and to claim that the South Korean parliament was dominated by the North Koreans, which is nonsense. And his putsch, his attempted coup d'etat against his own government, against the government and the constitution of South Korea, lasted only 6 hours, because immediately the parliament, including members of his own party, he is a minority position in the parliament, immediately voted to invalidate the martial law. The military briefly occupied the parliament, but then left. The trade unions rebelled. People got into the streets. So in a way, this is actually a very good story because it shows the depth of commitment by the South Korean people to their democracy, which is something that they have achieved with great difficulty and evidently value a lot. There's nothing in here about North Korea, really. This is internal politics in South Korea. But there will be an aftermath. President Yoon is now very likely to be impeached. Only 8 members of his party need to vote with the opposition to achieve the 2/3 majority that's required for that. There will be no president in Korea then for 60 days. Then there will be a new election. This is the most likely course ahead. And it is, as I said, it's a good story, not a bad one, because it is an affirmation of democracy in a place which didn't know it for a long, long time. Simultaneously, of course, we have a breakdown in the French government, and that is not a pretty story, and nobody can tell you what happens next. But I think South Korea is, and people just don't understand what an admirable society it is. 86% of Korean high school graduates go on to university. It is the most highly educated society on the planet. And this is reflected in its technological domination of numerous sectors, or near domination, its innovation, and its emergence as a major source of weaponry, for example, for Poland, which has been building up its defenses given the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So this brings South Korea to global attention in a way that at first sight is ugly, but on closer examination, it induces optimism.
And how do you see the situation with Japan? Do you think that Japan is going to have some sort of problems internally, as we saw in South Korea, or the case of Japan is not that what
No, the
people.
Japanese continue their slow reacquisition of a capacity to act independently. Japan is a world economic power without any question. And you certainly know that in Brazil. You see the Japanese investment and the Japanese Brazilian population actively engaged in that relationship. Japan, until very recently, was politically quiescent. It was very passive in Asia, in the Pacific Asian region, but it is now quite assertive. It is actively engaged, for example, in defense cooperation with Vietnam and the Philippines as part of an effort to build a network of defense relationships that is independent of its alliance with the United States. It clings to its alliance with the United States, which, among other things, gives it a nuclear umbrella, extended deterrence against a possible conflict with China or Korea. But it has also achieved nuclear latency. It could develop a nuclear warhead for a missile within a matter of weeks, not months. And so Japan is a country that is in the process of undergoing a resurgence in its influence. And it remains quite undecided about which direction it should go. Let me illustrate. Every improvement that Japan has made in its military capabilities, self-defense, which it's required to stick to by Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which we Americans wrote during the occupation, which says that it cannot maintain the capacity for offensive military action. But everything it has done, whether it's acquiring heavy lift transports in support of its participation in United Nations peacekeeping, or its development of aircraft carriers, which are pocket aircraft carriers. They hold vertical takeoff and landing aircraft and helicopters, or its development of missile technology, and so forth and so on. Every one of these things has been justified in terms of making a greater contribution to the alliance with the United States. But every single one of these gives Japan an independent capability, independent of the United States, and an ability to break off with the United States if it chooses. So what we don't know, because the danger of war over Taiwan is increasing, is what Japan would do. The United States could not come to the aid of Taiwan without using bases in Japan. And if we do that, those bases are very likely to be struck by the Chinese, assuming that's the scenario. And I think the Chinese will hold back. They will try to avoid embroiling Japan in a war with them. They had 14 years of warfare with Japan in the last century, and they don't want to repeat that. But Japan is in a difficult position. If it backs the United States, it is likely to find itself in a war with China. And it has a grave disadvantage in that it is a relatively small country, about the size of California, with a very, very dense population. And therefore, it is very vulnerable to bombing, especially a nuclear exchange. So Japan is struggling to figure out how it should go. On the one hand, it would like the United States to back it in developing a stable, mutually cooperative, productive relationship with China. On the other hand, it is quite anti-Chinese, and it has an affinity an emotional attachment to the Chinese in Taiwan, who were its colonial citizens for 50 years. And it's not clear how Japan will turn. So Japan is basically hedging, improving its options, gaining freedom for maneuver, and nominally committing itself to the United States, but actually developing the capability, if it chooses at some future time, to be separated from the United States.
When it comes to the Middle East or the West Asia, we had a ceasefire between Lebanon and Israel. In the same day, we had this new conflict just popping up in Syria. And just to consider what has happened, we have to remember that in 2020 there was an agreement between the government in Syria and these HTC, all these Syrian oppositions, and two agreements. One of them between the Syrian government and these people, the Syrian rebels, and the other one was between Iran, Russia, and Turkey to make these two cities as a demilitarized zone, Aleppo and Idlib. It's all gone, and a surprise attack in Syria. What's going on, Ambassador, there?
Well, first, I would take issue with your description of the agreement between Lebanon and Israel as a ceasefire. It's not a ceasefire. It's a lowering of the level of combat. There have been over 50 Israeli violations of the ceasefire, so-called, in the brief time that it's been in effect. Israel, with United States approval, reserved the right to continue to fight despite the ceasefire. So whatever this is, it isn't a ceasefire. And it's very fragile. And I'm not sure that Hezbollah is fully behind it. It's clear that Israel isn't. So it's no coincidence that when, after Israel had maimed Hezbollah, reduced its leadership to molecules and crippled some of Hezbollah's capabilities, that two things happened. First, Israel encountered a very hard level of resistance on the ground in southern Lebanon. It was losing the war, losing too many people, and that's why it agreed to a so-called ceasefire. Basically, as I said, lowering the level of conflict and regaining the initiative rather than actually agreeing to stop the war. It gained from this freedom of action against Hamas because Hezbollah had basically agreed that it would no longer create a diversion for Hamas in Gaza. It also complicated Iranian retribution or retaliation possibilities because it's not clear that Hezbollah now would agree or would in fact join in any Iranian attack on Israel to respond to the various Israeli provocations that have occurred. All of that is in the background. It is no accident that it is in this context, after Mr. Netanyahu said that Israel was going to cause Syria to pay a terrible price for standing with Hezbollah, that you have this attack by Daesh, the Islamic State, so-called, or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the jihadi movement that Israel and the United States have backed. This is ironic because the United States has basically found itself backing Al-Qaeda against the Syrian government and against Russia and Turkey. Turkey, of course, shares with Israel a desire to remove the Assad government, does not share Israel's interest in fragmenting Syria completely. Israel would like nothing better than for Syria to break up into a little group of ethnic enclaves, ideological enclaves. In any event, one has to assume that various actors aligned with Israel and coordinated with Turkey put Daesh up to the attack that it has mounted. And it has successfully subdued Aleppo, apparently, and it has done major damage elsewhere. Meanwhile, the Turks are trying to deal with the Kurdish Syrians who are associated with the PKK, the Kurdish party that is has been guilty of multiple acts of terrorism in Turkey. So it's a very complicated situation. Basically, you have multiple Syrian factions contending for power against or on behalf of the government, and each of these has a foreign backer, or maybe two or three. And it is a Rubik's cube that I cannot quite solve. I cannot give you a simple answer as to what is happening because I don't think there is one. And there are multiple parties attacking each other for multiple motives, backed by multiple foreign backers.
Hmm. How about the Iran and Russia? How did you find the reaction coming from these two countries?
Well, I think both of them share an interest in supporting the Syrian government and keeping Syria intact. For Iran, this is essential both because of national pride. It has been the protector of Syria historically, and the Syria, of course, is actually not a majority Shia state, but there is ideological affinity. Iran was joined by Hezbollah from Lebanon in defending the Syrian government against the jihadis, and there's a deep commitment there. But also, Syria is the bridge for Iran to ship weapons to Hezbollah and its allies, its partners in Lebanon. And that is, of course, why the Israelis have been bombing Syria, trying to stop that supply of weapons and deter the Syrian government from backing Hezbollah in Lebanon. So Iran's interests are very clear. Russia has a stake in this in part because it has a naval base in Syria, which is important to it. It gives it access to the Mediterranean beyond the Bosphorus and the Black Sea. It has an historic relationship with the Syrian regime going way back, and it has very cleverly used limited intervention in Syria over the past decade to enhance its prestige and make it the go-to diplomatic partner for countries in the region. So I think both Russia and Iran will continue to support the Syrian government. What is different now, that none of these things really are a change, but what is different now is that the Gulf Arabs, who previously had been cooperating with the United States and indirectly with Israel in trying to bring down the Assad government, have now made their peace with Assad and are not part of this. They are holding back. Qatar, in fact, is trying to do what it usually does in the case of conflict, namely conciliate or mediate between the contending factions. But nobody is in the Gulf, as far as I can tell, has resumed the effort to dislodge Assad from power.
We had yesterday I talked with Dr. Gilbert Doctorow. He said he has mentioned that it seems Erdogan tried to talk with Putin, but Putin rejected to talk with him right after this attack. And Iran sent its foreign minister to Syria. Then he went to Turkey, talk with them, and the president of Iran, Pezeshkian, talked with Putin. They're going to meet in the near future. There's something going on between these two countries, but it seems that they're so confused with the manner that Erdogan is just experiencing right now is just showing everybody, because with what has happened in Gaza, in the West Bank, and the conflict in southern Lebanon, and how important Syria was for Lebanon in this fight. And right now, as you mentioned, it's not a ceasefire between Lebanon and Israel, but at least the level of tensions just lowered. But at the same time, you see Erdogan goes with this plan. It's unbelievable in the mind of many people.
Mr. Erdogan is nothing if not unpredictable. And he has Turkish interests very much in mind. Those interests are far more complicated than many people realize. Not only does Turkey have an interest in the evolution of Central Asia, places like Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan or Kyrgyzstan or Azerbaijan, all of which are Turkic speaking. But of course, he has a great interest in Ukraine and in the relationship with Russia, even though he's a member of NATO. He has an interest in the Black Sea, remaining a sea of peace. He has interest in the Balkans, which were formerly Ottoman colonies, and retain relations with Turkey. He has a hostile relationship with Greece. He has a problem in Cyprus with the Greeks. And he has a very troubled relationship with Israel. He has recently patched up his relations with Egypt, and he's playing a very complicated game inside Syria, in which he's trying, on the one hand, to attack the government, and on the other hand, to attack the Kurdish opponents of the government. And though he's a member of NATO, he's contending with the illegal United States military presence in Syria. So it's very hard for a simple-minded person like myself to unravel all the things that Mr. Erdogan is doing at the same time. He's like a juggler with about 5 balls in the air. And I don't know how he does it, but he does seem to get away with it.
Do you find any sort of connection between what's going on in Syria and what's happening right now in Ukraine? Because we've learned that some drones that they're using, these groups are using in Syria, are Turkish, but they were made in Ukraine and they brought them to the region.
Well, I don't put this down to much more than 2 things. First, Ukrainian corruption. That is, you can buy anything you want in Ukraine if you're willing to pay enough. And second, the Ukrainian enmity toward Russia. And since Russia is supporting the government, this is rather odd. But anyway, no, I don't think there's much direct connection. Ukraine, of course, is beginning to realize at the official level that it has basically lost the war. And we see Mr. Zelensky, on the one hand, guilty of wishful thinking, saying, well, if you just admit me to NATO, then I will have the power to negotiate the return of a ceasefire, and we can use diplomatic means to recover all of the territory we've lost in the war. That is, of course, preposterous. It's not going to happen. But at least it represents a recognition that Ukraine is exhausted, its economy ruined, it is depopulated, and it is militarily exhausted and on its last legs, really. It's in this context that some of the talk in the West seems very unrealistic. For example, the German debate about whether to supply the Taurus missile to Ukraine. Whatever this does, other than provoke a Russian counter-escalation, possibly including the Oreshnik missile, which provides a subatomic, subnuclear alternative to nuclear weapons for Russia. It's not clear, well, it is very clear that whatever the Taurus can do, it's not going to change the picture on the battlefield inside Ukraine. And that is where Ukraine is losing, that and in Kursk. the tragic incursion that from the very beginning was doomed to be a slaughterhouse for Ukraine's best troops. So I think the Ukrainians are looking for ways out. I don't think they see any at the moment, and in the meantime, they're quite prepared to make money by selling items that they make to whoever will buy them.
But don't you think that the situation in Syria would distract Russia from Ukraine, or maybe do you find any sort of connection between these two things?
No, I think the Russians are quite good at setting priorities. They think strategically. Important as Syria is to them, it's secondary. Far more important is the prospect of a negotiation with Ukraine, with NATO, the United States, and the end of this war and the effort to establish some kind of stable peace in Europe in which Russia can feel unthreatened, even as it withdraws its threats to the West. So I think that's what the Russians are concentrating on. And of course, they have pulled a rabbit or two out of a hat with the Oreshnik. They probably have other surprises in store. And they are in a strong position in any negotiations that now occur. There, I noticed that one of the things that I haven't seen really significant commentary on is the offer by Austria to host peace talks. I think that's significant for two reasons. One, it's very constructive on the part of the Austrians, who are neutral and therefore in a position to do this. But second, it reminds us of the Austrian State Treaty of 1955, which contains all of the components needed for peace in Ukraine. That is the recognition and guarantee by great powers of an independent, neutral Ukraine, not part of NATO, which treats its minorities fairly, because that is a treaty obligation. So the Austrians have Italian, Slovene, Hungarian, and other minorities whom they treat with exactly the proper respect for their language and culture that Ukraine repudiated in 2014. So I think this is a significant straw in the wind, if you will. But I will conclude by saying that going back to Korea, some people have talked about Korea as a model for peace in Ukraine. That is, there would be a ceasefire, an armistice, there would be a demilitarized zone dividing the warring parties. This is, I think, totally unacceptable to the Russians for very good reasons, because the lesson of Korea is that if you do that, you perpetuate the tension and the war and the confrontation. You don't reduce the danger of war. It persists. And what the Russians want and what Europeans should want is a return to peace and stability in Europe. And that cannot be achieved with that sort of approach. But there is an element of the Korean model that I think is applicable. Namely, in Korea, from 1952 or 3 to 1954, the fighting continued even as peace talks occurred. So the negotiations at Panmunjom in the DMZ at the 38th parallel in Korea continued, even though the two sides were busily murdering each other on the battlefield, and the line of control was shifting back and forth to a limited degree. I think it's entirely possible that there will be no ceasefire before negotiations. Negotiations will not produce a ceasefire, but a ceasefire will emerge from negotiations. Negotiations first, ceasefire second. And in that context, we're talking about a very, very complex negotiating picture. because there are three issues. One is the issue that began all this, namely the rights of minorities in Ukraine, the rights of Russian speakers to educate their children in Russian and to communicate with local government in Russian. Hungarians to do this, and Romanians and others to do the same. These are rights that are guaranteed by the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE now, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which Ukraine's constitution originally respected, but which it repudiated in 2014 after the coup. So this is an issue which is of concern to Russians, Hungarians, Romanians, and the OSCE, and it is obviously a condition for Ukraine to join the European Union. So I think that is one issue to be negotiated in one forum. Second, there must be a frontier, a border between Ukraine and Russia, which both sides agree to. So that is a negotiation between Russians and Ukrainians. Now, other people may advise them, but basically only they can solve that problem. And then the third issue is the broader issue of architecture for peace in Europe. And that requires a Russian, NATO, and American negotiation joined by appropriate members of the European Union who also belong to NATO. So at the end of that, I don't know what the end of that would be. I myself would favor the Europeanization of NATO, the resurrection of the Partnership for Peace as a cooperative security mechanism backed by NATO, if you will, and the turning over of the command of NATO to a European, with the United States retreating to the background. I think the United States has to remain engaged in Europe because Europe and North America are part of the same geopolitical zone, and we cannot afford to let Europeans botch things in the way they did in World War I, World War II, the Cold War again. So we have to keep a hand in. But these are radical changes. They won't come about easily. None of the negotiations will be easy. We don't know exactly what Mr. Trump has meant by distancing the United States from NATO and insisting that Europeans play a greater role in European security and self-defense. And we don't know, his advisors may or may not agree with him. Because in some ways, he seems to have staffed his cabinet by opening Pandora's box and letting all the wriggling creatures in there out. Some of whom will not make it into the cabinet, it is clear. Some of whom may, and some of whom are uncertain. So, for example, he seems now to be considering whether he should nominate someone else to the Secretary of Defense position, maybe the governor of Florida, rather than the talking head from Fox News. So we shall see.
And Jake Sullivan recently said that by the mid of January, they're going to send a lot of weapons and a lot of aid to Ukraine. It seems that they're planning to do each and everything at their disposal before leaving Washington. And today we've learned that Antony Blinken said $50 billion from Russian frozen assets would, in the coming weeks, they're going to send it to Ukraine. Do you find it right now? Because before 2024 presidential election, if you remember, Donald Trump was talking about the policy in Ukraine. Right now, he's so silent. And considering his envoy to the conflict in Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, he said that if they send more aid to Ukraine, it's going to put Donald Trump in a better position for any sort of negotiation. Do you think that, because Donald Trump is silent, he's talking about Gaza, he's talking about attacking Gaza and killing more Gazans, he's talking about tariffs, but he's not putting out any sort of comment on what's going on in Ukraine right now.
Well, I think both President Biden and President elect Trump are maneuvering to ensure that each is able to blame the other for the defeat in Ukraine. Mr. Trump could benefit, arguably, by the contrast with Mr. Biden. Mr. Biden empties the treasury and the weapons depots of the United States for Ukraine in his last few weeks in office. This will gratify Mr. Zelensky, but it's not going to change the course of battle in Ukraine. The issue is not weaponry. The issue, or striking deep into Russia, the issue is what happens on the battle line in which the Russians are steadily advancing into a territory that was previously held by Ukraine. Now, I think Mr. Blinken's desire to transfer Russian assets to Ukraine is perhaps understandable, but this will have cause huge damage to the status of the dollar as a reserve currency, because we've been playing fast and loose with this issue all along. The current situation is that interest on the stolen Russian assets, which is what they are, they're stolen, interest on those assets accrues to Ukraine. If you start transferring the capital, then you have done something entirely different. And there is a record here of American confiscation of Iranian assets, Venezuelan gold and assets, joined by the UK in that, and of course the freezing of Russian assets. And the one thing you cannot afford to do if you are a banker, which the United States is to the world, is start pilfering your clients' money, stealing it. When modern banking was invented in Italy on the basis of Islamic models, by the way, which is why we have words from Persian like Czech in our vocabulary. When that happened, the Medicis and others knew that their survival and the ability to continue to make money depended on their keeping the assets of their clients safe. We are violating that principle. We have been. Mr. Blinken's proposal would take it a step farther. And I suspect that this will not go over well with the United States Treasury or the American banking community, because it is an own goal that could be fatal to the status of the dollar.
Did you see Donald Trump trying to intimidate the countries who are not willing to use the US dollar anymore? He's trying to intimidate them. He's trying to frighten them by putting more sanctions, tariffs, which is the main reason for which they have decided to not use anymore the US dollar.
Yeah, no, I think this is so contradictory and counterproductive that it's difficult to believe. But Mr. Trump's characteristic negotiating posture is one of bullying and threats. And this is consistent with that. By the way, so is Lieutenant General Kellogg's statement that if the Biden administration floods weapons into Ukraine, that helps Mr. Trump's bargaining position for a peace. There's a difference between Mr. Biden, who wants to continue the war, and Mr. Trump, who wants to end it, becoming plain. But, I think it is arguably not a good way to start off your administration by threatening Canada, Mexico, China, the BRICS, Europe, with economic warfare, which is what he's talking about. If you look at something like the North American auto market, which is heavily integrated between Canada and Mexico, what he proposes to do would kill American automobile manufacturers. And they are beginning to say so. I think some of his economic theories do not have wide acceptance, and there will be quite a battle politically over these things in the months to come.
And the other comment from Donald Trump, as I've mentioned before, he was talking about if you don't release hostages in Gaza, Israeli hostages, I'm gonna make a hell in Gaza. It's a hell right now.
Of
It's
course, it can't get any worse. And what Israel is doing there is utterly despicable. And Mr. Trump's not only his willingness not only to endorse that, but to urge its increase in the interest of getting the hostages out, which Mr. Netanyahu has never been interested in, is quite peculiar. And it raises questions about the extent to which he understands the limitations of the use of force and the background to what is happening in Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and potentially between Iran and Israel. So, in this context, we come back to the question of who his principal advisors are, and he's nominated a great number of people, including the convicted felon, his son-in-law's father, as ambassador to France. Now, for those who don't know what normal diplomatic procedure is, you never nominate anybody to a foreign country without first seeking agrément, meaning the agreement or acquiescence of that country in the appointment. But clearly, he didn't have French agrément. And clearly, Mr. Kushner, who's jailed for crimes which are really quite extraordinary and extraordinarily ugly, is going to face some sort of questioning in the Senate. And one of the big issues now, as you know, I've said before, and I now repeat it, one of the big issues in the United States is that we are, in effect, in a constitutional crisis. And Mr. Trump is trying to circumvent the power of the United States Senate to advise and consent to nominees' appointments. He wants to short circuit that by using an interim appointment authority when the Senate is out of session. On extraordinary occasions, the president can temporarily appoint someone to office. He wants to do this. Well, this is essentially a dictatorship in the making. And it remains to be seen whether the Senate will go along with it. There's not as much left of our Constitution as there should be. And we're in for a lot of very difficult fights politically in the United States over issues that have an effect on foreign governments and peoples, but which are essentially our concern, the concern of those who want to preserve constitutional government in a republic rather than an autocracy in the United States.
Ambassador, let me show you an article in the Telegraph talking about these groups in Syria fighting the government. And what's so amazing to me, Ambassador, we have here in Brazil, we have a large community of Syrians, Lebanese Syrians, and many of these Syrians who came recently to Brazil, and mostly Christians. And they love Bashar al-Assad. I didn't know that before. And they say these people who are right now in this article they're talking about, they're so friendly, they can make peace in that region. They have lost their family members because of the action of these people, because they don't tolerate, even you have to be Sunni, a very significant fraction of Sunni that they accept. They don't accept any other sort of belief. But how do you see right now the rhetoric in the mainstream media and the way that they're trying to reframe these people?
Well, I suspect the hand of MI6 in that headline. I note that the so-called white helmets, who have been a persistent source of disinformation and accusations against the Syrian government and its forces, have now re-entered Aleppo. These so-called democracy-loving jihadis, uh, quite an odd combination, um, are not regarded as legitimate Muslims by the vast majority of the Muslim world, whether Sunni or Shia. They are deviants, heretics, if you will, who have a very peculiar, brutal notion of Islam that bears no resemblance to what is written in the Holy Quran or what has been developed over 1,500 years of practice. So these are people who take delight in beheading people who disagree with them, including they are takfiris. They pronounce anathema on their enemies, and they treat their enemies much like Israelis treat Palestinians, as non-humans, animals who can be slaughtered at will. Some of these people are on film, for example, beheading an 11-year-old Palestinian boy, not to mention others. So these are not cuddly people, democracy-loving, sweet-tempered people. And you're quite correct. In Syria, Syria is a multi-religious, multi-ethnic society with, which is true of Lebanon too. Lebanon and Syria were once one. It was the French who divided them. The Christians in Syria have been very well protected by the Assad government, which is a very strange form of Shia religion, peculiar to Syria. There are Druze, there are Syrian Christians, there are Roman Catholics, there are Orthodox people, there are Armenians, there are Kurds. This is a very, very complex mosaic. And one of the reasons that Assad has been able to stay in power is that almost everyone except these jihadis and Israel, the United States, and Turkey see him as better than any of the plausible alternatives. I don't think anybody particularly loves him, except perhaps his wife and his dog. But the fact is that he seems better than whatever might follow him. And so what you're telling me about the Christian Syrians who emigrated is not a surprise.
Do you think that before this attack happening, there was some sort of coordination between Erdogan and Israel?
I think there had to have been, probably at the intelligence level, MIT in Turkey and Mossad in Israel. It may be that Turkey and Israel have a terrible relationship, which has resulted in a break in diplomatic relations, economic embargoes, and this sort of thing. But they're both quite ruthless and realistic and able to cooperate with each other out of sight politically. So yes, I think that probably is correct.
Just to wrap up this session, Ambassador, how do you see the future? With the conflict in Syria, we had the situation in 2016, 2017, which was Syria, as you mentioned, was in a very weaker situation because the Arab states were against him, and these groups were much more powerful. They captured much of the Syria in those days, and right now they're trying to do it again. Do you think that they're going to be successful, or Russia and Iran together would prevail together with the government in Syria?
I don't think they'll be successful because I believe there are too many Syrians who find them utterly unacceptable. But I note that these fighters are not just Syrians or Arabs or Kurds. There's a large Uyghur contingent there from Xinjiang in China, which is very hard bitten. They can't go back to China. They would be imprisoned, if not executed. They have nowhere to go. They are religiously fanatic. They support the absolutely deviationist ideology of Daesh. So this is not a group that is easy to deal with or defeat. I don't think you can have a negotiation with them any more than you can. Actually, I think the example of the so-called ceasefire in Lebanon illustrates the uselessness of reaching an agreement with the Israelis. They immediately violate it. That has been the case with the hostage release negotiations in Gaza. Now it is the case in Lebanon. But I think Daesh is equally untrustworthy and hardline and murderous. So it's a very ironic situation that Israel and the United States have found common cause with Daesh. But then, if you remember, the United States was allied with many jihadi elements in Afghanistan against the Soviet occupation. Those elements then gave safe haven to Al-Qaeda, and the result was 9/11. I think you deal with these people with great caution because they are treacherous and they are also capable of great violence.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Freeman.
Have a great day,
So
Nima.
pleasure to talk with you.
Good to talk to you. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.